Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z Flashback, a series of explorations of the 150 games that make up Atari Flashback Classics for Nintendo Switch. Today's game is Space War. This was a 1978 release from Atari, programmed by Ian Shepherd. It was designed to be an Atari 2600 adaptation of Steve Russell's famous 1962 game Space War, no space, exclamation mark, for the DEC PDP-1 minicomputer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The original Space War was designed to meet three precepts that its creators had felt were important for creating a program that was as enjoyable to watch as it was to play. 1. It should use as much of the computer's resources as possible. 2. It should be consistently interesting and have every game be different. And 3. It should be entertaining and therefore a game. The Atari 2600 version of Space War had 17 different variations, including 13 different dual options for two players to compete against one another and 4 options for a single player. Despite being based on one of the most important moments in video game history, Space War for Atari 2600 doesn't get a lot of love today, perhaps because there are other games that does what it does a little bit better. Notably, the 1977 launch title Combat offered a more varied experience for two players, though it did lack the few single player modes that Space War has. But Space War still has its appeal and a few unique features, so let's go play Space War.
Okay, here we are once again with Atari Flashback Classics, today taking a look at Space War. So, since this is primarily a two-player game, I'm going to hand over to Future Pete in a little while, but we'll take a quick look at the manual first, and also the single-player modes that are on offer, and then I will hand over for some two-player action. So, the manual, here we are. The Space War game program TM features two games, Space War and Space Shuttle. Space War games are for two players only. The objective is to score points by blasting your opponent's starship with missiles as you battle in outer space. Space Shuttle has games for 1 and 2 players. The object is to connect your starship with the space module and score points. Okay, so the controls in this will be familiar to anyone who has played Asteroids or anything similar. It is a turn and thrust thing, and because Atari assumed that this would be relatively new to people at the time, there's an extensive section of instructions on how to control your spaceship. So just like learning to drive a car, it takes a bit of practice to learn how to control your starship during Space War and Space Shuttle games. The following exercises will help you gain proficiency in controlling your starship. Game 14, a Space Shuttle game, is an excellent practice field. So, I mean, this is almost like a tutorial you would get in a modern game. It's giving you several exercises to explore and give you a feel of how the spaceship handles. So all about changing direction and adjusting your speed and so on and all that sort of thing. So here we are, Space Glossary. Space War and Space Shuttle game playfields are characterized by different galaxy variations. The following description will tell you what to expect when a game features any of these variations. So there's a galaxy boundary. In some games your starship cannot penetrate the playfield boundaries and will instead bounce off the edges. Warp drive. Move your starship off one edge of the galaxy boundary and it will go into warp drive and reappear on the opposite side. For example, move your starship off the right edge and it will reappear on the left edge. Space Sun. Fight the pull of gravity from the sun in the center of the space galaxy. In some games, your starship will explode from exposure to the extreme heat and reset to the starting position. Yeah, so that mode there is probably closest to the original Space War game, which had like a gravity well in the middle that you could sort of whip past and that sort of thing. Hyperspace. Pull your joystick towards you, your starship goes into hyperspace and becomes invisible. When in hyperspace, your starship uses more fuel. It is impossible to fire missiles or to be hit by your opponent's missiles or to collide with the space sun while in hyperspace. To make your starship drop out of hyperspace and reappear, pull the joystick towards you. So that is not hyperspace like it is in Asteroids, which just sends you to a random location on screen. That literally makes you invisible. So you can use that as a means of hiding your position from your opponent, and then, if you've calculated things correctly, popping up behind them and popping a missile right up their bum. Starbase. Make contact with a starbase at the corner of the galaxy to refuel and resupply your missiles. Your missile and fuel gauges at the top of the playfield will reflect resupplies as your starship resets to the starting point. Okay, so here are all the different variations. Space War games last 10 minutes or until one player scores 10 points. Player scores appear at the top of the playfield and are colour-coded with the starships. The two lines to the right of your score refer to fuel and missile supply. The top line is the fuel gauge, the bottom line is the amount of missiles remaining. Each player begins with 8 missiles. Once the arsenal is depleted, the game will automatically reset each player with the 8 more missiles only when both players are out of missiles. In most Space War games, fuel cannot be resupplied. So Game 1, Galaxy Boundaries. Game 2, Galaxy Boundaries and Hyperspace. Game 3, Warp Drive and Hyperspace. Game 4 has the Sun. Game 5 has the Sun, Warp Drive and Hyperspace. Game 6 has the Starbase, along with Galaxy Boundaries and Hyperspace. Game 7 has the Starbase, Warp Drive and Hyperspace. And then we're on to Space Shuttle. Warp Drive on Game 8. 2 players each control one starship and attempt to connect with the module, which is colour coordinated with the ship. Okay, so you have one each in Game 8. In Game 9, 2 players are competing over one space module. In Game 10, you have one ship each, but there's a Sun and Warp Drive. In 11, there's a Sun and Galaxy Boundaries. That sounds quite tricky. Game 12 has Galaxy Boundaries and a single module. Game 13 has Galaxy Boundaries and 2 space modules. And then there's the one-player games, 14, 15, 16, 17. So Game 14 is Warp Drive. Game 15 is the Sun. Game 16 is Galaxy Boundaries. And Game 17 is Space Sun and Galaxy Boundaries. Okay, fairly complicated, but as you'll see, it's not super complicated. Actually, 2 versions of this manual, you see. We've been looking at the slightly later version here, but Atari Flashback Classics is actually including the earlier version of the manual here as well. It's got all the same content, it's just presented a little bit differently. Actually a little bit clearer, if anything. Anyway, let's have a go at the single player modes then. So Space War, so game select until we find the right thing. It was like game 14 or something, wasn't it? There we are, 14. One-player docking game, wraparound edges. So this is one really nice feature of Atari Flashback Classics. If you can't remember what all the different game numbers are, it just gives you a little caption at the top of the screen to remind you what it is. So, the first of the single-player games, all we have to do is catch that dot. As you can see, thrilling sci-fi adventure action right here on Atari A to Z Flashback today. Amazing scenes as the pink shuttlecraft attempts to dock with the tiny pink space module and fails miserably in the process. There we are, there's one. This is basically the spaceship equivalent of that mode in Race or Indy 500, where you have to drive around and collect the dots. Except in this one, the dot is moving incredibly fast. And thus, ideally... Oh, God, I missed. Thus, ideally, you need to position yourself somewhere where it will naturally intercept you. Which is something I'm having fair amount of difficulty with here. Oh God. Why do I do this to myself? Oh, I don't want to appear up there. I want to be ready for the space module. Give me the space module. I totally collided with that then. Maybe you've got to do it. Maybe it's got to be the tip of your nose colliding with it or something. Equally ridiculous. It's not really ridiculous, to be honest. It's just a bit harsh. Because even with the 2600's massive pixels, it's not very easy. Oh God, why? Nope. No point for me. No! My nose went through it then, and I didn't get a point. Right, this time. Watch this. Watch this. No, maybe this time. No. Okay. Well. Come on. Oh! This is actually impossible. There's a game on the Philips G7000 video pack called Space Rendezvous. And when I first read the description of Space War, I thought it was going to be like that. And Space Rendezvous has its flaws in that it doesn't give you anywhere near enough fuel to dock with the space module more than once. But it's implemented much more nicely than this. It's implemented as a sort of lunar lander style game in which you have to thrust carefully, land on the planet, and then make it back to the module at the top of the screen. That collision detection is just not working, is it? Well, okay, I think we get the idea of that mode. One player, docking game, wraparound edges, Space Sun. So this is exactly the same horrible gameplay as we had in the previous one, only this time we can get pulled towards the sun in the middle. And the space module does not get pulled towards the sun in the middle because, I don't know, it has some sort of magic anti-solar engines or something. Oh, no, it does. It does. I stand corrected. I apologize for my lack of faith in this awful game mode. Right, come on. Come on now. Come on now. This is ridiculous. Nope, too fast. Oh, there's one. Right. Another one. No. Come on, get it. No. This. No. What's this? This is so hard. Particularly when the bloody collision detection doesn't work. See, this game would probably be a whole lot better if the space module sprite was much bigger, but since it's using one of the 2600's missile sprites, it's basically like just one big pixel, and you see sometimes you just go straight through it and it doesn't do anything. Oh man. Starting to understand why people don't talk about this game all that much these days. I mean, it's cool in concept in that it's an adaptation of like one of the original video games, but like, there's so much wrong with this game mode from a design and mechanical and execution perspective. That it's just not very fun. And like I can't imagine this mode being any more fun with two players, because it's still subject to the same problems. It's still subject to that same issue that the collision detection doesn't work very well. The thing you're trying to grab is too small. And the whole thing just behaves incredibly inconsistently. Okay, forget that mode. Let's have a look at one-player docking game where you bounce off the edges. So this time around, the space module bounces off the edges instead of wrapping round as well. So in theory, this might make it a little bit more likely to be able to get in position. But still, I've collided with it a couple of times already, and it just hasn't registered as a point. Right. That worked that time. So what appears to be happening with this is it's using some sort of Pong-style quasi-physics. And when you dock with the space module, it just sort of bounces off your spaceship as if it's a paddle. But it's feeling almost like not all of the spaceship is acting as a paddle, which is unusual because old school collision detection worked by looking at overlapping pixels rather than hitboxes. Whereas in this, there are times when it just doesn't seem to be registering a collision at all, despite the two sprites clearly overlapping. So I'm not really sure what to do about that. God, can you imagine sitting here and playing this for 10 minutes, just trying to... Looks at clock. Just trying to desperately to score 10 points. And there's no on-screen timer or anything like that, so there's not really any sort of replay value either, unless you're timing yourself using a stopwatch or a digital watch or something like that, which I guess is something you could do. One thing to remember is that a lot of these early Atari 2600 games were designed as a means of sort of facilitating fun rather than providing all of the fun for you. And so in that sense, you would sort of play one of these games alongside some other tools or something like that. You would have a notepad to keep track of high scores, or you would have a timer to track how quickly you could score 10 points, or that sort of thing. No, this is just absolute nonsense. Let's try the last one. One player docking game, bounce off edges, Space Sun. And this just makes it even more even more impossible to actually grab the thing. No. You know me. Throughout this entire series, I've made a point of giving these games a chance, because a lot of them sort of get written off by people as like, ooh, basic maths was 2600. Why would you ever want to play that? That sort of thing. But most of them have had some sort of redeeming quality about them. Most of them have had something vaguely enjoyable about them that you can enjoy, even if it's obviously a very primitive way of experiencing video games. But this is just absolute bollocks. It really is. Yeah, I think this is another example of a concept we talk about quite a lot on this series, which is that during the during the early Atari 2600 era, the concept of game genre is something that was still being explored and defined in the first place. So a lot of developers were experimenting to find out what worked and what didn't work, because there was no real precedent. I mean, in theory, this concept for a game works. Here's a concept for a game. You control a spaceship and you have to fly around and dock with a moving space station. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But the trouble is, if you have a good concept, you've got to implement it properly to make it work. And there's just so much wrong with the implementation of this game mode that, yeah, it's a concept that could have potentially been sound, but which doesn't work as a single-player game. And I can't see it working as a two-player game either, so I'm not going to inflict this on my wife when Future Pete enters the picture. We will just play the Space War games, because I suspect they will be the highlight of the experience. I can see those working well and being enjoyable, but this is just absolute nonsense. So yeah, I've given it a chance. I've played this for like 20 minutes at this point, and it's just not very fun. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Future Pete, and he and his wife are going to play some of the competitive two-player modes where you actually shoot each other rather than trying in vain to dock yourself with a tiny pixel that is moving too fast for you to ever be able to catch up with it, using clunky, cumbersome controls that no one likes. So anyway, sorry to be so negative about that, but, you know, they can't all be winners. Let's hope the other game modes are a bit more fun. I will hand you over to Future Pete right now. Okay, Future Pete here, and welcome to the esports event of the century, as my wife and I play Space War for Atari 2600. We begin with the first game here, which is a pretty straightforward game where both of you just have to shoot each other as many times as possible within the space of 10 minutes, or the first to reach 10 points. I am in the pink, and my wife is in the blue. And we're already underway, as you can see. So, the stuff you can see on the screen there, the number is your points, obviously. The top of the two bars is your fuel level, and that goes down when you are thrusting. And the bottom bar is how much ammunition you have. So you have a limited number of shots, and in this game mode, and indeed most of the game modes, you don't get any more shots until your opponent has also run out of bullets. So there's a certain tactical element to this where you have to sort of conserve your shots almost. You can't just fire willy-nilly because it's very easy to just run out of bullets. Gonna sneeze. Excuse me, why does this happen every time I start recording? Anyway, yes, you have to be a little bit tactical because you could quite easily run out of bullets and leave yourself entirely vulnerable to your opponent, particularly if they've been stockpiling their shots or just not shooting. So, this first game mode that we've got here, the one gimmick is that you bounce off the sides of the screen. So this is what was referred to as the Galactic Boundary in the manual. So that means you can't wrap around the sides of the screen, you bounce off the sides, and also your shots bounce off the sides as well. So you need to bear that in mind while positioning yourself and trying to line up some shots. Now, as you might expect from a game like this, a game that looks like this, we are using turn and thrust controls here, which I've never been a huge fan of, but over the course of exploring this compilation, I found myself, I don't know if I want to say warming up to, but certainly getting a bit more comfortable and confident with them. My wife, meanwhile, is not a big fan of them at all, and was kind of struggling to get her head around the fact that in order to stop yourself bouncing around like she is here, you need to thrust in the opposite direction that you're moving. And if you're constantly bouncing back and forth, it could be quite difficult to figure out which direction you should be thrusting at any given moment, because obviously you're alternating between directions, so you also need to time your thrusts carefully. You also need to time your thrusts carefully in order to stop yourself moving in the direction that you don't want to be moving in. So you see there, she's thrusting downwards while she's bouncing back and forth, so it's not really having much effect on her speed because she's already moving back and forth. So any deceleration she gets from thrusting down while she's moving up is immediately negated by the fact that she's then thrusting down as she's already moving down. Now, I attempted to give her a brief tutorial in the middle of all this, which is what we see going on here, I think, and try to explain that she needs to time the application of the thrust so that she's applying thrust in the opposite direction to what she's moving. But she was really struggling with this initially. And understandably so. Although for those of us who have been playing games for many years, it might feel like a reasonably intuitive control scheme. The problem is that it does take a lot of getting used to, particularly if you're more accustomed to games with a more direct control scheme that involve pushing a particular direction to simply go a particular direction. And indeed, most of the games my wife and I have played on this pack up until now have had a fairly similar control scheme. I think probably the closest thing to this that we've played together is Combat. But in Combat, you don't have the kind of momentum aspect that you do in this. You don't have to worry about the sort of reverse thrust side of things. In Combat, you're either moving at a constant speed in the aircraft games, or you're only moving forwards while you're pushing forwards in the tank games. So this one is a bit of an adjustment, particularly if you've never played stuff like Asteroids and things like that in the past. And although my wife plays a fair few video games, she doesn't play a lot of sort of the old retro classics and that sort of thing. So she's more accustomed to this direct control scheme, where you push a direction and you move in a particular direction. If this game had been released a lot later, it would probably have an analog control scheme where you could literally push in any direction and move in any direction. But as it stands, we were working with digital joysticks at this point, so it had to be turn left, turn right, thrust forward. And in this second game mode we just started, we introduced the concept of hyperspace. Now, unlike the hyperspace in Asteroids, which simply sends you to a random location on screen, what hyperspace in Space War does is that it turns you invisible. And while you are invisible, you can continue moving, you can continue turning, thrusting, all that sort of thing. You can't shoot, but you can keep moving around the screen while keeping your location a secret. Now, that means that if you are familiar with how your ship moves and all that sort of thing, you can position yourself at a point on screen that will surprise your opponent. Now, it's a little tricky to do with the amount of momentum that your ships have in this, because you'll often find that you need to apply a lot more thrust than you might think in order to actually have any real impact on your direction. So my wife there in the blue, moving back and forth like that, it will take a substantial amount of thrust in the opposite direction to stop her from bouncing around like that. But after a while, she just sort of leaned into this and decided that if she was just moving quickly, it would make her harder to hit anyway, naturally. And then she could just sort of fire every few seconds and so on. And either the bounce mechanics or the wraparound mechanics, depending on which game mode we were playing, it would probably take care of hitting me now and then. And you can see from her score that it's working. It's working. She's got 3 points to my 4 at this point, and it's working quite well. Now, the one downside to hyperspace is that you use fuel more rapidly while you are in hyperspace. And in the game modes of Space War where there is no starbase, you can't refuel yourself. So once you're out of fuel, like she is now, you're pretty much defenseless in that you can fire, but if you try and move, you'll explode, which will give your opponent an easy point. So at this point, my wife is pretty much a sitting duck, and there we go. 10-3. Alright, so on to the next game. We now graduate from Galactic Boundary to what they call the warp mode, if I remember correctly. This is where, instead of bouncing off the side of the screen, you wrap around the side of the screen. So if you go off the left, you reappear on the right. If you go off the top, you reappear on the bottom, and vice versa. And the same is true for your shots as well. So your shots will keep flying for quite a while. You see, they'll get probably about 2.5 screen widths before they disappear naturally. And so you can use that to set up some quite entertaining traps for your opponent. If you fire them at a nice angle that will eventually intersect with the direction that they're moving. This is one of those games where I feel like an understanding of certain mathematical principles would probably stand you in good stead. Because you'd be able to determine the best angles to fire at in order to make yourself most likely to hit your opponent. It's something that will become instinctive after a while to most players, but if you actually have a solid understanding of the mathematics behind it, I'm sure it probably helps. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of these games were designed in the first place primarily to be demonstrations of an entertaining application of mathematics, after all. But there we go. Bit of a poor showing for my wife in this one. She got a point, but ultimately absolute destruction this time. Okay, so moving on to the next game, we go back to the Galactic Boundary, but this time we have a sun in the middle of the screen. Now, the sun has two purposes. It exerts a gravitational pull on anyone who gets vaguely close to it, and it also kills you and awards a point to the other player if you collide with it. So while you can use it to sort of whip around the middle and pull off some entertainingly high-speed maneuvers, you've also got to be very careful not to actually collide with it. As that gravitational pull is actually surprisingly strong. You need to thrust a decent amount in order to break free of it. And even there, you never really quite break free of it because you'll end up bouncing off the side of the screens. There's only so much space on the screen anyway. And yeah, it makes quite a difference to how these battles unfold. It makes it much less likely that you'll get caught in an endless cycle of just bouncing up and down in the same direction, for one thing. You'll see between the two of us, there's much more sort of variance in our movements in this one. There's much more sort of manoeuvring carefully. It's an interesting mode, but also the inherent danger that the sun provides also often makes for a bit of a quicker game as well. So 9-4 to me again. Can I get the last shot in? Or will the sun claim it for me? I'm out of bullets. That's the problem at this point. Just waiting for my wife to launch her final salvo so I can reload. There we go. And there we go. The sun claims the final point. Okay, so next game. Same thing again, only we've replaced the Galactic Boundary bouncing with wrapping around the sides of the screen. And so we still have the gravitational pull, but this time you can break so far free of it that you wrap around the screen and end up approaching it again. Which is something you need to be very careful of. Now you see, both of our movements have become much more sort of careful and considered at this point. Because we were both kind of starting to get a feel for the control scheme and how it worked. And also the challenges that sun in the middle provided when you were trying to have a friendly match against your opponent. Another crash straight into it from me. So yeah, for me personally, these modes with the sun were probably the most interesting things that this game had to offer. because they provide just enough sort of interesting variance and danger to keep things exciting. And it's not randomness, because you can understand how the gravitational pull of the sun is working. But it does provide a certain degree of variance and unpredictability. Because in the heat of the moment, while you're manoeuvring, you're not necessarily thinking about the exact area of influence that sun has on the screen. And so in pursuit of that one perfect shot, you might inadvertently find yourself in a very awkward situation, staring down the sun, just as I've done there. So I'm pretty sure this one is almost over. Oh, just missed. There we go. Caught on the wraparound. That's one of the most satisfying things you can do in this game. Okay, then we move into the final games that we look at. So this time the dot in the middle is not the sun. It does not exert a gravitational pull. It is instead a starbase. And what the starbase does is when you dock with it, it replenishes your fuel and your bullets. So instead of having to wait for the other person to run out of bullets in this one, you can just go and restock whenever you want. And so this is probably one of the first ever competitive deathmatch games with a manual reload function of sorts. So you see, there is one thing you need to bear in mind when you reload from the starbase, and that is when you dock with it, it sends you back to your starting point and stops all your movement as well. So canny opponents will be able to keep an eye on when you need to reload, camp your spawn point, and blast you as you reappear. So you see, this game really was revolutionary in a lot of ways, because it it was probably the first place we saw a lot of the behaviour that really upsets people online today. But again, this is an interesting game mode. I think the starbase does add a certain amount of unpredictability to this, a little bit like the sun. Not quite in the same way as the sun does, but the fact that if you don't sort of position yourself accurately, you can find yourself getting sent back to your starting location and losing all of your speed. That can be very dangerous sometimes. So in this last variant, as you can see, the main distinguishing factor is that we got the starbase again, but no Galactic Boundary this time. We have the wraparound sides of the screen. My wife decides to try a brand new approach, which is simply to thrust as hard as possible, travel at ridiculous velocities, in the hope that I would never ever be able to time a shot correctly to hit her. And to be fair, it was actually a reasonably sound strategy. And it works particularly well in the wraparound mode, as you can see. So, we came to call this strategy the Death Rain, because she was moving so fast that it was hard to hit her, and also when she fired a bullet, that was also moving so quickly and unpredictably and wrapping around the screen that it was almost impossible to avoid them. Because she'd picked a great angle there to fly at that covers a lot of the screen with the wraparound. So if she just kept firing there, she could hail down this absolute rain of death on me. And there was not a lot I could do about it, aside from trying my best to position myself somewhere that I could time my shots carefully and hit her. Or alternatively, I could just do exactly what she was doing and see if that also worked. And you see, eventually you reach a point where you're flying at the same speed in parallel, and you can actually have a really fun little dogfight when you're doing that. Just trying to adjust your speed. Hit the starbase when you need to. Fire a shot across the path of your enemy. And there you have it. So I'm in a dangerous situation here. There we are. Managed to reload. But yeah, the manual reloading in this is a really interesting twist, particularly if you start getting into high-speed confrontations like we did there. And we eventually settled down into this final conflict here, and victory was eventually mine. Okay, so that is Space War for Atari 2600. A fun game. Not the best in some ways, but it does have some entertainment value, especially if you're playing with a friend. So, let's leave that there for today then. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.